very good afternoon. Hope you're having a wonderful Saturday. Welcome to the Indo-American Arts Council Literary Festival, yet another edition, getting bigger by the year. And my name is Satish Kolluri, and I'm a professor of media and communication studies at Pace University in downtown New York. And I've been part of the council since its inception almost, early 2000s. And I'm also part of the curatorial team of the New York Indian Film Festival. So that is our, one of those events that stands out as far as the council is concerned. And so for today, we have Barkha Dutt. And Barkha needs no introduction in that sense. She's a familiar face in our living rooms. So Barkha Dutt is an Emmy-nominated journalist who used to work for NDTV, and now she has her own independent digital platform called Mojo Story, and so that will come up during the conversation. And in fact, also to remind you all that her books will be on sale. Her book will be on sale outside in the Author's Lounge, and she'll be signing them. So with Mojo Story, a new chapter in her life began. And so what I'm going to do is to open it up in one sense with a couple of questions from myself, and then have the floor participate. So I'm sure you have questions for Barkha too. This book is unsettling, depressing. The response from me was very visceral. When I was finishing it up too, I teared up at many places because I remember following this happening on Mojo, on Twitter. And if there were, actually for me, there were individuals who stood out during the coverage of COVID in India. One was Barkha through her Mojo Story, traveling almost 30,000 kilometers across 17 states during the first wave and the second wave. And then the other was this individual called B.V. Srinivas, who on Twitter was basically responsible for supplying oxygen cylinders to people in Delhi and elsewhere when the structure broke down. Right. So let me start off with the word experience. And there's this word experience that we kind of don't really comprehend in that sense, where we look at it in terms of the past, but there's a meaning attached to it, where we are having this experience right now, which is sensory, which is auditory, which is visual. Right? This is the experience, this is reality. But there's also an experience with memory. Right? So we experience memory too. And that experience happens through thoughts and perceptions. And we keep going back in the past. And so what happens then when that memory, to pick a line from here, this book, and there's so many entry points I can think of, but then what is that memory in your sense, Barkha, when you say memory is a beast?
Thank you, Satish, and hi everyone. It's good to see some familiar faces, some new faces, so thank you for coming here. Before I answer Satish's question, he did speak about the book being unsettling, and it is, but in many ways, it's not a book about COVID. It is a book about India. It is a book about people, and that's why it's called Humans of COVID. I think for so long, whether here in the United States of America or in India or elsewhere, our life was, defined by a word called dashboard. Every day we would wake up and we would check what the dashboard, the caseload was, what the death figures were, what the hospitalization figures were. But who were all these people? And how did our own lives change? This is a city where I grew up. I went to public school as a child here. I went to grad school here. This city, I find, has changed. All of our lives have changed. And while we want to forget the last couple of years, the fact is that the more you fight memory, to answer your question, the more it comes back to actually haunt you. For me, this book is also very personal. I lost my father to COVID. One of his closest friends, Andy Bhatia, is here in the first row. He brought me and my sister up as a single parent after my mother died when I was 13 years old. And for me, it was very surreal because I had spent 1.5 years before he died reporting on the pandemic. At a time when most TV channels in India, I don't know how it was like here, but in India, the channels didn't put boots on the ground. They didn't send people out. It was anchor-driven, the coverage. People sat at their homes, people sat inside their studios, and very, very few people actually went out. I was one of those who went out. My digital platform, Mojo means magic, by the way, and I was on this journey to recover the lost magic of journalism. And I had literally, founded the platform 3 months before the pandemic, and the pandemic hits. We're 5 people in the basement of my house. And I'm like, this is the biggest story that in my lifetime, and I've seen some big stories from war to calamities, and I said, this is the world's biggest story. How can I not be out there? And as I set out there, I became more and more immersed. We had a humanitarian crisis in India in addition to the medical crisis because we had India's poorest citizens leaving the city to go back to their villages, walking on foot. And as they would walk the expressways, there was no one with them. I was shocked to see the absence of media. And that is a big part of, we must talk about the role of media in this. And so I became obsessed with telling this story. For those of you who are familiar, and I'm sure many of you are, I traveled by road from Delhi to Kerala. I spent 130 days consecutively on the road. There was no place to sleep. There was no food to be had. Everything was shut. We had a very stern lockdown. And in the first wave, we didn't have public transport open either, which is why I had to go by road. And so COVID became the sort of center stage of my life. And by the second wave, when airports were open, I was able to fly around. As my father died, I became the news I had been reporting. It was the oddest thing. I had stood outside hospitals. I had been inside ICUs. I had gone into slum tenements. I had walked with the migrant workers. COVID was my everything, but it was still me telling a story about other people. And then when you lose someone closer to home, you become the story. And I remember I tested positive for COVID the day we cremated him. And I came back and I didn't know what to do with myself because I was sick and I was grieving and I didn't know how to grieve. And so I did the only thing I knew how to do. I locked myself in my basement. For the 10 days I was sick, I kept doing my show because I thought I would collapse if I paused. And the day I got well, I took his ashes, I planted them in a rose tree at the back of my house. I sat in my car and I drove out again because I didn't know, and I'm sure a lot of you have similar stories. When you go through a big emotion, some of us deal with it by confronting it, some of us deal with it by avoiding it, and hence I write in my book, Memory is a Beast. I dealt with it by just not dealing with it, by working. And being here in this city today, Andy Uncle knows this, my father loved this city. And when he went into hospital, my last words to him were, you get well and I'll take you to New York. We'll go to New York together. It was very difficult for me to come here. So, that separation between me and the story I'm reporting, it collapsed for me. It collapsed for me well before my father died, actually. Even in the first wave, if you see, some of you may be familiar with my work, there are people crying in my arms. There's an old lady who's been thrown out of a house by her children. I find her sitting alone, Leelavati, outside a railway station. She has nowhere to go. I'm saying, where do you want to go? She says, you get me home somewhere. I said, where's home? She said, actually, I don't have a home. But, before my husband died, I used to live in Delhi. If you can get me there, I'll beg. Because I know the streets. There's another lady, Poonam. Her husband has sold the only thing he owns, which was a mobile phone for 2,000 rupees, with which he buys a pankha, a table fan, some roti, dal, feeds his children. Poonam is happy. This week we'll get through. He can't take it anymore. He takes her dupatta, he ties it to a bamboo pole, he takes her life, his own life. And so, even to say this out loud, there's an element of unrealness. We're sitting in Chelsea in this, gallery, and we're looking back. Looking back is very difficult because memory travels with us into the present. And yet we don't know how to be a co-traveler. We're constantly pushing it away. This is not just true about the pandemic. This is true about anything that is deep and felt for any of us. It could be different things in your lives too.
The words that jumped out at me, compassion, courage, defiance, denialism, and those are words that can be applied universally.
Of course,
during the
yes.
pandemic, right? I mean, this is like, on the one hand, you say personal is political, but the pandemic made it the personal is universal. And the suffering became universal. I lost dear friends, family members. What is interesting also is another word which starts with E, which is equity, right? And I was reminded of this quote by Rudolf Virchow, a Prussian epidemiologist, who said that all medicine is social science, but politics is nothing but medicine on a grand scale. So to kind of flesh it out a little bit, it is where, and I want you to address this in a comparative sense, did nations, say for instance with stronger social and political institutions, have a better a way of dealing with this, coping with the pandemic, although they had millions of deaths like in America, or the breakdown of social and political institutions, say in India, for instance, casteism, bigotry, where here we were celebrating healthcare workers. In India, they were ostracized. They were not allowed to come back home, right? And when I talk about denialism, I'm talking about science, the thalis, the thali beating, the diyas, right?
Let's start with that last symbolism. Actually, when that symbolism took place, it was very powerful. I remember, that sense of being able to look outside of the balcony of your home. And in the pandemic or in any crisis, the first thing that you feel is alone. So it's very important actually for any government anywhere to remind people that there's a community, right? So the symbolism is not just to encourage health workers, the symbolism is to keep people's hope alive. The symbolism is to make people feel that if we stand together, there is still a community. What is happening in my house is also happening in the house next door. And I remember feeling very moved by the symbolism when the diyas were lit and the thalis were banged, because neighborhoods were resounding with the sound of this. It was very powerful. It was even more moving to walk into homes where a poor family, like I said, Mukesh Mandal, a house painter who took his own life, or to walk into the house of, let's say, a healthcare worker, a nurse who may have lost her life. And you would see on their little ledge, where there was very little else in their home because they were very poor people, there would be a single diya. And you could see that on that day, that the symbolism was called for, they too had lit that diya. They too participated in that symbol. Now, you raise an interesting question about equity. So I want to say two things here. There is an assumption that certain nations did better and other nations did worse. I actually challenge this assumption. I think it's the West's way of looking at the East, and it's a Western gaze. And I'll give you an example. Of course, many things went wrong institutionally in our country, and many things went wrong here too, right? If there were uncounted bodies in India, there were uncounted bodies here. If health workers were overstrained, there were health workers overstrained here. Yes, some things were unique to the Indian experience, like stigma and fear. Let's talk about that. One of the sort of terrible tragedies that I saw unfold was an enormous amount of fear that we will be socially ostracized. This is in the beginning, if we are counted as COVID positive. And at that time, local administrations had, I think, a flawed system of leaving stickers outside your house if you were COVID positive. They thought they were warning off other people that there should be isolation. But unfortunately, even our local, any of you familiar with RWAs? If you have families in the cities of India, they're resident welfare associations, okay? So they're these neighborhood bodies who are meant to impose rules locally. And I call them tin pot dictators, because they just came up with the most kind of stupid, unscientific things. Like in front of my house, there was a park. The one place that was safe to be out in the open was the park. They went and locked the park. And they said, no, everyone must stay inside. You must not go out into the open. There is actually, the more people who were inside, unless they never met another human being, you were actually safer out in the park. So there was this unclear science. It was not helped by the Ramdevs of the world getting in and making anti-allopathy remarks. So there's a lot of superstition that was encouraged by characters like him. There was fear of social ostracism. there was a fear even of touching the body of somebody you loved. The most sad thing I saw was people leaving the bodies of those they loved outside hospitals, throwing them in the river, leaving them in the banks of the, on the shallow banks of the Ganga. So there was stigmatization. That was very tragic, and that didn't sit well with that symbolism where everybody wanted to feel like a community. On equity, in the beginning we were told that the virus is the great equalizer globally. We were told, "Arey, ye to aisi cheez hai, this is one such thing that it doesn't leave anyone untouched." It has touched all our lives. Partially true, but only partially true. What the pandemic did, and I think it did this everywhere in the world, is wherever there was an existing inequality, it made that inequality worse. So women experienced the pandemic differently from men. Millions of Indian women stopped working. Cases of domestic violence spiked. Thousands of girls were forced into underage marriages. Obviously, the big divide was class. My book opens with the story of a village called the Village with the Yellow Water. It's 1 hour from the capital of India. And at that time, the governments were exhorting people to wash hands because we didn't know it was airborne then. So people were saying, please wash your hands as often as you can. So I went to this village. This village was surrounded by factories. As any of you who may have driven from sort of Delhi towards Punjab may know, that entire expressway has a number of factories. And so we went into this village, and I found that most of the villagers were these poor, again, contract workers, out of work. There was no economic activity. And they used to buy their water. And I said, what? They said, yeah, our drinking water is not potable. So the water that we get from the supply is not, we cannot drink it. So they used to buy a bottle of mineral water for 10 rupees. And then one of the women led me to the village tap. And we opened the tap, and what came out was yellow water. And then they showed me that if they washed their hands with that water, because it was contaminated by the chemical affluence of the factories surrounding it, it was toxic. And so their skin would break into this rash if they washed their hands with that water. And I start the book with that story to make exactly this point, that 1 hour away from Delhi was this village. I didn't even know of it. It framed for me the deep inequalities that were getting worsened with this pandemic. But I want to say one last thing. The inequalities were not just within nations, they were also between nations. And at one point, and I remember this very clearly, and my father had died, and I was very agitated because, he hadn't got his second vaccine. And at that time, the Indian state had not purchased enough vaccines. The vaccine rollout had been slow. There had been a complacency that had set in after the first wave. And I kept thinking, if he'd got his second vaccine, maybe he would have lived. And then I looked to this country. I wrote a column about this in the Washington Post, where the anti-vaxxer movement was in full swing. And vaccines had just been bulked up and stacked up. And there were people in other parts of the world just dying. And here, you couldn't mandate a vaccine. You couldn't make masks mandatory. You couldn't, even link returning to work at that time with vaccines. It was such a deeply politically divisive issue. And I remember writing this piece saying that it just is shameful that the most powerful country in the world has been unable to mandate vaccines. So the inequities were both within nations and between nations.
So before I open it up to the floor, my last question. There's so many chapters here that swing between the first, second, third person perspectives, the narrative shifts between the individual and the structure, which I really liked. Because as you're getting lost in the story of the individual's suffering, and suddenly the structure comes into play, and then it becomes visible. So in that sense, inequity too. But I wanted you to talk about the children of COVID, because, this pandemic affected everyone's mental health. Everyone's. I mean, let's be honest about it. And children especially. And that chapter, basically, I mean, I was in tears, reading it, yeah.
So one thing I'd like to say before I speak about the children, there are many sad things that we look back at in the last 2 years, 2.5 years. But I also want to remember, because we spoke of memory, that feeling of hope, that feeling of having formed a new relationship with a stranger whom you didn't know but who sent you food. I'll tell you, in my case, when I was driving across India, and because nothing was open, people who were following my journey online would actually pack me food and send it to me. This included people who used to troll me otherwise, like, on Twitter or on Instagram. They were suddenly, what are you doing for food? And I said, I would not say anything, and they would say, can you give your address? And that's how I survived. We survived on food sent to us in every city or small town of India, sent to us by strangers. My car broke down, people were like, take our car, take our car. My shoes broke, a shoe shop, Metro Shoes opened their shop to send me shoes because my shoes had broken. But it wasn't just with me, it was also, just one story I'll tell and then I'll talk about the children. I met a man called Abdul Malbari in Surat. And his office was the size of a closet, and he had one ambulance. And on that ambulance were written 4 words in blood red. And the ambulance said, funerals for lonely humans. And Abdul Malbari's one sort of commitment in life is that nobody should die alone. Right? Because human beings, there are people who are lonely, who have nobody, who feel desolate in the last hours, and we saw a lot of that happen in COVID. So what he would do is, when families would not claim a body, or when families were too scared to claim a body and they would just leave the body, irrespective of religion, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, didn't matter, and he had all of the religious samagri, I don't know what the English word is for samagri, or like the material, like the Ganga Jal, let's say if you were doing a cremation, the rosary, the namaz mat, everything. For every religion, he had what was needed to perform the last rite. He was a Muslim, but when I met him that day, he was going to bury a Hindu baby, because babies are not burnt, of course, in Hindu tradition. So he was going to bury a baby at a cremation ground because nobody else was prepared to touch that baby. So I just want to make the point that, visceral as this was, heartbreaking as this was, and depressing as it was also a reminder that in moments of great crisis, when sometimes institutions don't work, people still have other people. And there is still something alive in us that rises to that occasion. And I drew a lot of hope from that experience in I would say, the bleakest 2 years of my life. Children of COVID, so many ways to look at it. All of you who have children will know that surveys across the world show that when children stopped physically going to school, there was a decline in their cognitive and social skills, there was a decline in their learning capacity. In India, we had amongst the longest physical school lockdowns in the world. We cannot blame the government for this, because every time schools would try and open, one section of parents would fight with another section of parents, and they say no. Until all of the parents agreed, schools were not willing to take the risk. So 2 years. 2 years our schools remained closed. And in fact, look, I'm a political junkie, as some of you who know me know. But when elections were held in the second wave, I boycotted the coverage of those elections. Because I said, this is just wrong. Your schools are closed and your voting booths are open. This could have waited. I was very disturbed by it. I watched myself in villages, in a single home where there was one phone, and that was the only way to access, let's say, the digital classroom. I watched boys being allowed to take that class while their sisters were told, go and do something else. I watched those sisters, 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, then being told, go get married. Let's get you married, because what else are you doing all day? I watched, even then, a moment of hope among those girls in one village in Rajasthan who said, we're so sick of being told to get married at 14, 15. These are children. Every day, our village elders ask us, what else do you do? So we said, we'll play football. So they formed a football team, and a local activist actually started training them professionally. I watched, as I said, girls call up the government-run child helpline to talk about abuse at home. Those numbers increased. And finally, the orphans of COVID. I sometimes at night, I can't sleep, and, things come back to haunt me, and I keep thinking of little children I met, children who rode with their mother in an ambulance, and sometimes drove 200 kilometers, because that, in rural India, that was the situation. Your little hospitals were full. Drove to a hospital, watched the mother die in the ambulance. Now orphaned. Right? And I'll end with a small story which has both hope and tragedy in it. In Bangalore, there was a a worker in the tech sector, in the IT sector. And his daughter was 9 years old, and his wife had been expecting their second child. And she was 6 months pregnant when she died. And it was the same story, hospital to hospital, oxygen ran out, all of the same thing that the world, in a way, grappled with in their own way. And this father did not have the heart to tell the child that her mother had died. So he told the child, who was still small, that your mother has gone to meet goddess Durga. And with Durga, she and Durga are fighting this thing called COVID. Yeah? And he couldn't tell her anything more. So when we met the daughter, she kind of repeated that story. But of course, she knew that something was off. And then he was so broken. The baby was stillborn, obviously. The mother died, premature stillborn. He again couldn't make himself go and cremate/bury his child. And so again, an interfaith group went and did that for him. And he said, these are my new brothers. He introduced these, sort of these men, multi-faith. He said, these are my new brothers. And finally, I remember...
The pallbearers of COVID.
The pallbearers of COVID. And finally, I remember meeting a 9-year-old boy. Buses had finally started, and he was getting into a bus to go back. He was a daily wages son. He was getting into a bus to go back to his village several hundred kilometers away. And I said to him playfully, I was pulling his cheek, and I said, do you know what coronavirus is? In Hindi, I said to him. And he said, yes, I know, of course I know. And I said, what is it? And he said, I'll say it in Hindi because it's more authentic, then I'll translate it. Coronavirus ka matlab hai mujhe khana nahi milta. Is a 9-year-old's understanding, because that was his experience, right? And so that is the point, that people experience this, different classes, different countries, different genders, in different ways, right? A domestic help worker who worked in the skyscrapers of Bombay, I met her in a slum in Bombay, and she said, ye kahan ka insaf hai कि ये जो वायरस है ये एरोप्लेन पर बैठ के आया और जो गरीब आदमी है वो सड़क पर चल रहा है. What kind of justice is this, that this virus traveled on an aeroplane to the country, but it's the poor man who's walking on the streets of India today. So, I think there's a lot to learn from what we've gone through. And I think, as, Charles Dickens would say, it was not the best of times and worst of times, but in that worst of times, I still want to emphasize that the kind of human compassion, the kind of human heroism that coexisted with prejudice, with bigotry, with fear, with stigma, we must as human beings kind of recognize that we carry both of these things within us. Each one of us sitting here is capable of being both. And really, which part of us do we want to tap into?
So I'm going to have you all. So we have time for a few questions. Yeah, please go ahead.
First COVID? Maybe the mic, I can't hear you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. What is probably the first COVID resilient village in India, in Telangana. It is called Rajanapet. You might have heard of it.
Yeah.
And in the process, what we saw was that the real heroes were the rural healthcare workers.
Yes.
Who had been completely ignored. In the rural areas, people who didn't have access to Twitter, they had no way to ask for concentrators.
Yes.
And after COVID, I'm afraid that the healthcare workers, especially rural healthcare workers, have been forgotten once again. So I don't know if you feel that we're ready for another pandemic, and if we do have it, whether India's healthcare workers will be able to give the same that they gave.
Yeah. Satish and I on the way were talking about the power of the individual and also the power of the community. And I think you raise a very important point about Asha workers, they're called. Asha in Hindi means hope. And these are women at their community level health workers. Before the pandemic, they were on the streets trying to say we don't get paid enough. Nobody, including people like me, covered them. There is also, in the book, if you read, there are also several mea culpa moments about my own journalism, how I'd lost touch with people, how COVID reminded me what, there was a growing gap between the news that people saw and what they cared about. But Telangana, I'll tell you, I'll start with the story of hope and then I'll answer your question. There was a community health worker who all her life wanted to be a nurse. But like so many women across India, she was pushed into marriage at a very small age, right? She was the only girl in her village to have basically studied till class 10. And then during the pandemic, she became a healthcare worker and she went to every door to try and get past vaccine hesitancy. Vaccine hesitancy was not a major issue in India, but in pockets of rural India, there was this issue, so to ensure the vaccine. And then she contested elections and she became the sarpanch of her village. So there are moments of hope. There were many stories from rural India in particular where the power of one, there was a Adivasi, a tribal doctor turned bureaucrat in Maharashtra. He had grown up in a hut. His mother was an illiterate, poor tribal woman. But he, through the system, became, first a doctor, then an IAS officer. And in his district, right, his name was Rajendra Bharut. And in his district, between the first two waves, he was the only bureaucrat who thought, let me order oxygen plants. As you all know, by the second wave, the real crisis was no oxygen. He spent 83 lakh rupees within his allotted budget and he got it was just that. And his village was unscathed. There was another lady I met in Dharwad in Karnataka. And I said, how did her district had prevented these workers from leaving on foot. And I said, how did you do it? And she said, you remember all the colleges were closed. So the first thing I did was I had hostels open. So I told all of these workers, you don't have to go anywhere. You don't have a place to stay. Remember, daily wage workers in India live on makeshift sites. A house is coming up, they'll be given a shack. They're painting something, they'll be given like some yahi pe so jao kind of thing. So she used all the empty hostels of every closed educational institution. And then she said, what, this is not enough. I want them to feel like I feel something for them. So she had the power to open the Khadi Gram Udyog in her district. As some of you may know, every state in India, there's still a government-managed khadi spinning sort of division. And she got them closed. It was like, it'll seem so meaningless to you at one level, and yet it made all the difference. Her workers didn't leave, right? So we have to remember the power, Abdul Malbari, you have to remember the power of the individual, the power of the community. Are we prepared for a pandemic? Look, we learned things from every wave. From the first wave, we made some mistakes, we didn't make them in second. In second wave, we made some new mistakes, we didn't make them in the third wave. I still believe the problem is that we do not prioritize health as a mainstream electoral political issue. The city I come from, I became asthmatic in my 40s because of the air. Why isn't it a bigger issue? Why aren't we, the people, making it a bigger issue? And I think this is a question that many people would be grappling even here with. What are the issues that people vote on? At least in this country right now, with the midterms, reproductive autonomy seems to have been a major issue. It seems to have been finally mainstreamed as an electoral issue. So we need to get to the point where actually elections are fought and won and lost, basis holding our administrations to account on how they deliver on issues such as this. Otherwise, I fear that not enough has been learned.
I mean, that is the point I was making about the strength of political and social institutions. Because when you're talking about, following mask mandates or vaccine strategies, in fact, the whole, chapters on vaccines too. So, yeah, I mean, and also see, I mean, not just rural India, but also urban India, household staff got thrown out overnight. I mean, it was nuts. I mean, I remember berating my friend in Hyderabad. I mean, how could you do this? This is like family to you, you can't do it. Yeah, question please. Oh, sorry. You had a question. Go ahead.
About your poetry, I remember, yes. I can't hear you. It's a echoey room, so I can't hear. Yes.
Thank you. I've also compiled an anthology that got published 2 years ago, 1 or 2 years ago, 2020, and then 2021. So that was also on the pandemic. But I'm going to ask you a very academic question. I didn't get a chance to actually read your book, but I would imagine there are 5 vital elements, so to say, that one would think about, seriously consider before kind of, diving into a subject like yours. And these 5 vital or essential elements towards writing a successful book, notwithstanding your well-known status, so to say, in Indian political life or Indian political journalism. These 5 elements would be A, theme or subject matter, B, truth, number 3 or C would be memory or musing. 4th would be first-person point of view narration. Is it first-person point of view narration? Is it a subjective account? Is it a memoir? It's not a memoir. It's like a factual book. You're kind of recounting.
So it's a chronicler and the protagonist in that book.
Yes. So yes. So it's kind of loosely, of course. There are elements of a memoir as well as like you're talking about.
I mean, my life is not the last 2 years. I'm 50 years old. I have lived longer than the last 2 years. It doesn't tell you anything about me before those 2 years.
Yeah.
So it's not exactly a memoir. It is partly, it's a very personal narrative about my reporting. And it's a story about India.
Yes, I commend you for that. Like, I would find it very difficult to kind of confront such, issues on a personal level also. But back to the question I'm asking you, an academic question. Of these 5 elements, which of these 5 elements did you find the most challenging and why?
I mean, I think that there are 2 aspects to why this book was so difficult to write. One is that people want to forget things that made them sad. Including me, right? Including me. So I remember when I went, I traveled to London. I was on a fellowship at Oxford, and I took 6 weeks off to try and start the process of writing this book. And I would cry every night. It would be gray outside. I was sitting alone. I wouldn't talk to anybody. I wouldn't meet my friends. I would weep every night. I would cry myself to sleep. I would mostly not sleep. I called my editor at one point and I said, I can't do the book. I'm not doing it. And she reminded me that I had told her that given that I got a ringside view of history as it was unfolding, I had to treat this as the first draft of history. And I was there. I chronicled that story.
That's exactly, when I was reading the book, I thought 200 years from now, if people are reading this book, forget about the visuals, just reading this book in a classroom setting, oh my God.
Yeah.
Hey, Barkha, I'm a huge fan of your courage reporting. I'm Deepak Jose. I'm from Kerala.
Nice to
I
meet
live in New York. See, I lost my grandfather and uncle during the COVID period. It was a tough time. And the Kerala government did a fantastic job during the COVID times. But here is something that we noticed. The minute you criticize the Indian government, if you don't live in India, suddenly there is a lot of polarization. You become a anti-national, the instant you criticize the government. And I want to get your perspective on how is media freedom, the ability for the individuals to talk about the government, criticize the government, coming along in the last few years?
Okay, so you've asked a lot of different questions in that question. Okay, so let me try and address some of them shortly because we don't have that much time. Yeah, so this needs another talk. I just gave one on India's media landscape at UPenn, in fact. But look, polarization first takes place in politics, and then it gets reflected in media. And I've always wondered, does the media reflect the divisions of society, or does it make them worse? And I suspect it's a little bit of both. So like here, where there is such a divided country and then such a divided media, unfortunately, I would say, India is also very divided, though not in the same way. We are not yet at the point where we can't have a samosa with somebody we disagree with politically. We can still laugh about it, we can still shout and scream at each other, and then say, chal yaar, let's have a drink. Right? We are still those people. We're still those people. We've not yet reached the point where, although I'm sure family WhatsApp groups are having quarrels and arguments, right? I can feel the murmur in this room that, mothers and daughters and fathers and sons and so on have been arguing. It happens. But as long as the argument is alive and you haven't stopped communication, I think that's healthy. I don't like the polarization. As a journalist, I have a word, a Hindi phrase, which I want to patent because I think it's so funny. For our media today, and I say the problem with, this is only about India, I don't know anything about here, is that our media is either chamcha or morcha, which means you're either sucking up to power or you're activists. You're either sycophants or you're activists. Where's the journalism? What is the role of a journalist? So this is something we're confronting. Now, of course, this phrase anti-national, this is used too loosely. I'll tell you my story. When I cut my teeth covering war. I have reported on the military my whole life, right? So I'm actually not even the classic left of center person that you'd imagine, like on national security, because of my exposure, because of how I've been molded, my politics are quite different. And yet, after the second wave, I was very committed to trying to find out why bodies were being uncounted, right? Why were Indians being uncounted? The World Health Organization, I'm not saying I agree, the WHO hasn't covered itself in glory, but just to give you context, the World Health Organization says 10 times more Indians died than were officially released in the official figures. What was the truth? Others said 4 times, some said 3 times. So I actually took a boat down the Ganga and I tried to chronicle what was happening. Were bodies being abandoned? Why were they being abandoned? In villages, people were dying at home because they could never get a test. In our country, if you didn't have a test, you weren't counted as a COVID death. If you died from a shortage of oxygen, you were. For this, I had to go to cremation grounds and graveyards. When I started doing this, I had people on Twitter calling me a vulture, right? Because they said I was feeding off the dead. And I said that every family that I had met of who had lost someone, the two things they always said to me was, please tell our story. Because nobody wanted to die unchronicled and uncounted. And everybody wanted to at least be counted. And for the poor, this was financial. Because there was compensation ordered by the Supreme Court if you had died from COVID. Now, there were poor people who had sold phones, little pieces of jewelry, their land to pay for hospital fees. And so this compensation mattered. And I thought this was a public duty I had to do, but I was called a vulture for it. Right now, I think you were asking me, how do you deal with this name calling? And I said to him, I don't care. And he said, how can that be? How can you not care? And I said, look, it took me getting to 50 to not care. When I was 25, I cared. I cared a lot about what people thought about me when I was 25. But you grow older and you grow more comfortable with yourself. You grow more comfortable with who you are. And what I'm trying to say is that this noise that we experience on social media, I don't find people to be like this offline. I have many friends across the political spectrum. I have an argument with them, we have a good laugh, and we have a good time. And I think as long as human relationships can transcend political differences, that is democracy. How can democracy be to never talk to somebody you have a different ideological point of view from?
Okay, we are like 8 minutes away from closing. Can we have a question so that...
2, 3 questions together? Yeah.
I'll try to be brief.
No question. I'm going to take 3 questions and then please go ahead.
Every act of writing is becomes part of literature in the broadest sense. In the Western literature, there is a whole tradition of chronicling the pandemics, starting with Boccaccio, his introduction to the Decameron. Very graphic account of the 1483 plague. Then there is the fictionalized account by Camus, the plague itself. Then I was trying to remember the third one. Swift, Jonathan Swift's, the Journal of the Plague Year or something like that. I'm yet to read your book, but I'm hoping that it will become the part of the annals of world literature dealing with.
Well, thank you. I would only say to that I don't have such a sort of sense of self-importance. I'm a journalist, I'm a reporter, I wrote what I saw. What I do hope is that, as Satish said, 200 years from now, I would say 10 years from now, when we are more able to look back at this time in our lives, this would be a documentation of the truth of our times.
Yeah, hi, my name is Narayani Ganesh.
Hi, Narayani, yes.
Yeah. I just want to ask you, like, this entire unfolding of the pandemic and the COVID cases and the migration and the deaths, etc., has been very dramatic. So it was something that was very easy to chronicle, easy in the sense not because of your efforts, but it was there.
It was there.
There,
it was there.
visible and human interest and suffering and everything. But there's something going on now which nobody has really written about, which is called long COVID. So completely healthy in young individuals who have no comorbidities, and many of them are doctors who have worked with COVID patients. So they find that they have slowly become debilitated and they are unable to function for 15 months. So they have to take disability leave, and their pay is cut by 50 to 60%, when in fact they got COVID because of their service as COVID warriors. So some injustice is going on, as well as people say, oh, it's a mental case, she's psychologically suffering because of what's happening. There's nothing wrong with her. She looks good, she feels good. She looks good, she sounds good. But the patient says, but I don't feel good. What do you do? The x-rays are okay, the blood pressure is okay, the oxygen level is okay, but not able to walk, has to walk with the walker, and joint pain, etc., etc. So how would you like to take this forward? Yeah.
I would like to qualify by... I'll just briefly...
Come back.
What? Oh, the early marriage. Oh, the child marriages. Okay.
And if COVID hadn't happened, would these girls have been able to finish school and marry with their own choice?
Okay, they're two very different questions here. Please let me my answer to you. I am not a medical expert. My book is not about medicine. Okay? I am in no position to judge what is the sort of medical research on long COVID. That being said, one minute. That being said, one of the things I had committed to as a journalist is that once COVID fell off the headlines, I would not let it fall off my journalistic pursuit. So we have done innumerable shows on long COVID. We have got global experts on. We have documented interviews with people who felt they can't go back to work. Lancet now has reflected that COVID is not just respiratory, it is also neurological. So as a journalist, this is all that I can do. I am not a medical expert. So beyond that, no, we are on that and we have continued to be.
Anuj is child marriage, and also Andy had a quick question.
Okay.
Barkha, I knew that your dad was in the hospital. And the next day, when I watched BBC News, I came to know that he had died. You had cremated him, and you were reporting on BBC News. What prompted you to go? Was it the journalist in you? Because you were a grieving daughter, but you were on TV reporting on this.
Yeah.
Could you?
Okay, two very different questions. So I'll answer this. And do you want to add one? Go ahead.
Quick question. Your intrepid nature is well known. But how is it India has such a large shelf of journalists? How is it that nobody else went out like you did?
Okay. Okay. Hanji. Okay. These are...
Okay. Yeah. We'll be winding up.
Yes, okay. I'll start with you. It's not that no other journalist went out, but television channels, which had the most resources, they did not put boots on the ground. They decided to report the story either from the studios or from their homes. I don't know why. It was a failure of television in the first wave. This story, there was some excellent reporting done. It's time to give credit to those journalists as well. Hindi newspapers, the Dainik Bhaskar in particular, was at the front line of documenting, because it had bureaus in small towns of India, in villages of India, which the channels and the English newspapers were not focusing on. There were photographers that worked with independent small platforms like mine who also went out. Local reporters, what we call stringers. Today in a village, if you have a mobile phone, you can document something and actually send it to the big channels. So language press, vernacular press, in particular newspapers. Lots of other independent digital platforms did excellent work. By no means am I saying that I was the only journalist who told the COVID story. But certainly, I think what made my work unusual was that mostly newsrooms have bureaus. So you'll get somebody sending in a story from somewhere and somebody from somewhere. Whereas I had this vantage point of actually being on the road, covering the span of India, one person, me. And that gave me a very unique perspective. Secondly, it gave me the capacity to report the walking migrants like nobody else, because I was on those highways. So no such self-claim or self-importance that I was the only reporter. There was excellent reporting done by our Hindi press, our Hindi newspapers, our small town reporters, our photographers. I just want to underscore that. Mine is just a personal perspective, by no means the only one. Child marriages. India has actually successfully contained. No, but I want to say our numbers were getting better. We had made a significant amount of progress. And in fact, one of the ongoing debates in India is to raise the legal marriage for girls, which I support. There are two views on it, but that is what is, because, you know, this idea that girls, the one thing central to their lives is unki shadi karo. This is being now, the government is relooking at it, I support it, right? So I think this is a fight that we were making some progress on. Unfortunately, what happened in this pandemic is that boys had more access to classrooms than girls, right? And I do believe, yes, that if the pandemic had not happened, if schools were not locked down, this was in Rajasthan where I witnessed this happening, and I think the girls would have been able to at least complete school. I don't know uske baad kya hota, but I do believe that. How widespread was this practice? I think the thing is, there are specific states where this is a custom. For example, Rajasthan is one. So there were two reasons. One, yeah, there's a whole chapter on it in the book, maybe you can find out. Okay. Was it cathartic?
That's what you should do. So buy the book. There's a whole chapter, read it.
Yeah, okay. It was partially cathartic, but it was very difficult for me to write it. I found it very difficult to write. I forced myself to write it because I believed that I had a unique ringside view of a moment in history. And I owed it to myself that when we are more ready to look back at this time, I should write it. It was partially cathartic, but I don't think I've really dealt with everything I feel about it. Now to your question. I remember that interview. The BBC and ITV called me up the next day and they said, your father has died. I was in my basement. I didn't know what to do with myself. Are you willing to talk to us? And what made me do it, and I almost broke, I mean, you can see in that interview that I'm crying, my face is ashen, it's white, I've been crying all day. Why did I do it? One, I wanted to tell the story of my father. I thought the world should know about my father. But journalistically, I had been documenting grieving families. I had been on the other side. When they had just lost somebody, I would ask them, do you want to speak? And they would want to speak. And I felt that now that I was the subject, I owed it. I had interviewed very vulnerable people, and I was vulnerable, and today I had to be able to be the person being asked the questions instead of asking.
Thank you, Pepal. Thanks a lot.